So thank you everyone for joining us. I know evening weeknights can be challenging, so appreciate your interest in the topic of the inextricable connections between food systems and climate. Tonight, we're going to address some of the key issues in this area, the urgency of addressing the climate impacts of food and agriculture, how we can reduce food and agriculture related emissions, the health benefits of doing so, and some promising policy solutions in this area. But first, I want you to sit back and imagine a future in 2050 in which we transition nearly all of our energy sources from coal and natural gas to wind, solar, and other renewables. Public policy and infrastructure investments have made biking, walking, and public transit the easiest and most used forms of transportation. And people are purchasing most of their food from local and regional producers. In what otherwise a best case scenario, and we reduce emissions from all other sectors. However, global meat and dairy intake continue to rise with GDP and population growth in line with the current projections. What do you think our chances are of avoiding catastrophic climate change, the most catastrophic climate change scenarios? So I'm going to ask some of you to raise your hands if you know this feature on Zoom. You can go down to the bottom and there's reactions, and that'll give you the option to raise your hand. So I want you to raise your hand if you think we'd have a pretty good chance of meeting our emissions targets if we reduce from all other sectors, but continue our current trajectory in food systems emissions. Anybody raising their hand? All right, how about who thinks that we would have a slim to no chance of meeting our emissions targets? Well, those of you who are raising your hands, I think get the message. And if you're raising your hand now, you're correct, and I'll explain why. I forgot that there was a burger reminder. So just as a reminder, climate change is one of the greatest public health and ecological threats to current and future generations that we've ever faced. We're looking at crippled droughts, flooding, and unpredictable freshwater access, which will decrease our food and water security, cause more frequent and intense extreme weather events, increased mortality for humans and animals due to the extreme heat conditions, people having to, in coastal cities and communities having to move due to extreme weather events, and increased spread of vector and waterborne diseases as a result of these changes. And lastly, increased damages from flooding and wildfires. Because of all these changes, scientists came together and politicians came together to determine the best ways we could avoid the most catastrophic climate change scenarios. It's inevitable that some of this is going to happen. We are already on a trajectory that is moving, but how can we avoid the worst consequences and the worst potential damages? And then back in 2015, global leaders signed the Paris Agreement with the goal of keeping average global temperature rise, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, at this point, 1.5 degrees Celsius is looking very unlikely. We're already on track for about 2.5 degrees. But the more that we can keep it below 2 degrees and ideally below 1.5 is necessary to avoid the worst scenarios. To see how challenging it will be to meet these targets, my colleagues and I reviewed some of the scientific literature in advance of the COP21 Paris conference. This was back in 2015. And we were looking specifically at the literature associated with food systems emissions to reach our climate mitigation targets. This figure summarizes the findings from one study in Nature Climate Change, but several other studies have since come to similar conclusions. So if you look here on the y-axis is the gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And this represents current as in 2010 emissions when we were looking at that study from agriculture and land use, so food systems related emissions. The land use comes from deforestation to produce land to raise cattle and for feed, both for humans and animals. And this other sector, this other chunk represents all other sectors and the emissions associated with those. So here are our projected emissions in 2050 if we continue business as usual scenarios in terms of meat and dairy intake rising with GDP and population growth, as is expected by projections from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. Now, this red dotted line right here is the threshold we cannot cross if we hope to meet our climate mitigation targets and avoid the most catastrophic climate change scenarios. This is for a 66% probability of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And this is the threshold for all sectors. So as you can see, emissions from agriculture and land use change for food systems eat up almost the entire budget. And remember, we also need to fit energy, industry, and transportation related emissions below this line. And again, this is the 2 degrees Celsius target. The more ambitious 1.5 degrees Celsius target would be even lower. In other words, we need drastic and urgent emissions reductions across all sectors, including an urgent shift in food systems and agriculture related emissions to have any hope of staying below this threshold. And that was just an illustration of how much we need to reduce emissions from all other sectors too. So what can be done about this situation? Well, there are several ways to address food and agriculture related emissions. On this left side, we have ways to reduce or mitigate our emissions. Key ways that we can do this include reducing emissions through shifting towards more plant-rich or plant-forward diets, and we'll get into some of those details to come. Reducing food waste and improving agricultural practices, such as by reducing the use of synthetic fertilizers or better managing the manure streams, and also some potential technological changes to reduce emissions or improve efficiencies. And on the right side, we have other strategies that can be used to create or enhance carbon sinks that either remove or sequester carbon and other greenhouse, well, specifically carbon from the atmosphere on managed or replanted forests, croplands, or pastures. Now, most experts recognize that there is not going to be a single silver bullet solution to address food and agriculture related emissions, and that will likely require elements of all of these approaches in order to significantly reduce food systems related emissions. And in fact, the climate mitigation organization, Project Drawdown, produced a great report a few years ago highlighting the various ways that the food and agriculture sector could address climate change. The report outlines the importance of approaches that focus both on immediate emissions reductions, that category on the left from before, as well as improved agricultural practices, including more regenerative style practices that sequester carbon. I do want to mention, though, that while considering both approaches, it's important to remember and understand some key differences between them too. These key differences relate particularly to the timeline of impact and the reversibility of impact. So this is an area under significant debate currently in both the academic and policy community, is in particular related to sequestration benefits and how they're not necessarily permanent. So you may have heard of improved food production practices to sequester carbon into soils. And while there's a great potential here, one projection by Project Drawdown shows up to 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. One of the challenges is that this potential is limited by being dependent on specific climate and soil conditions. It can slow down after a few decades, and it can actually be reversed if, for example, you're using a no-till method to help sequester carbon and a farm returns to tilling later or returns to poor grazing practices, or even if a severe drought or flood happens, which, as we know, are becoming more common due to climate change. This means that we shouldn't necessarily, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't promote more regenerative style sequestration efforts, especially because it can provide many other benefits to the soils and local environments. But it's important to recognize that we cannot depend solely on this approach to address our food systems issues, even if it's the more politically salient option under discussion. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus more on this emissions reduction category, but just wanted to highlight that there is still a significant potential in the sequestration realm, as long as we understand its potential limitations and its potential reversibility, and that those are key elements to continue when promoting these solutions. All right, so we're going to go back to this figure for a minute. This is showing the situation, the trajectory that we're on. What could we do to reduce or start to address some of these concerns? This study in particular modeled two different emission style reductions, one in which a healthy diet was adopted, and this diet would entail limiting red meat intake to about 2 3-ounce portions per week, and poultry to 1 3-ounce portion a day, along with levels of dairy, eggs, sugars, and oils recommended by health organizations. And it could reduce emissions by a significant amount. And that, along with cutting food waste by about 50%, would reduce overall projected emissions to be closer in line to where they currently are in proportion to other sectors. The key take-home point here is that if current trends in meat and dairy intake continue, we will more than likely exceed our target climate mitigation temperature, our target for global temperature rise, without even addressing other emissions from other sectors. And so these significant reductions are necessary. And since we published this report back in 2015, based on that study, many other studies have come to similar conclusions and how urgent it is to address food systems related emissions to meet our climate targets. Why such substantial reductions in meat and dairy consumption in particular? Well, in general, animal foods, which are, I guess my figures didn't come here, but sorry. The animal foods, which is this segment to the right, are found to have been orders of magnitude more greenhouse gas intensive to produce than most plant foods. Beef, lamb, mutton, goat meat, and shrimp and prawns have some of the highest impacts. Without getting into too many of the weeds, though, there are some exceptions and nuances. For example, there are some climate-friendly animal foods. So you can see insects here, as well as forage fish and bivalve mollusks. These all have relatively low greenhouse gas footprints compared to other foods. You might be wondering about the impact of beef in particular, as the range of potential impacts is quite large here compared to other foods. And there are a lot of claims about certain forms of cattle production being part of the climate solution. Oh, there some of them appeared. Well, the short answer for beef is it's very complicated. Under certain well-managed conditions, pasture-raised or regenerative systems depicted at right can have a lower greenhouse gas footprint than feedlot finished cattle at left. And this is due to that potential carbon sequestration benefit that we talked about. The challenge is that not all grazing systems are created equal. There's certain types of operations that may, in some cases, have higher greenhouse gas footprints than feedlots per pound of output. There's a lot of nuance and factors to consider, including the level of soil degradation that you start at. If you start at a more degraded soil, then you have a greater potential to sequester more carbon, but you'll eventually hit the point where you've sequestered the most that you can in that amount of soil. It's kind of like a sponge that once it absorbs enough water, there's no more it can absorb. So that's where that limit depends a lot on the soil's conditions that you start with and also how they're maintained over time. The science is still evolving on the issue. And though either way, it's important to remember that we're looking at a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, one that is orders of magnitude higher than most plant-based foods. It's also important to consider the big picture beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. The rise in meat consumption in the US has been sustained due to a rise in industrial food animal production. Over particularly the last 50 to 70 years, the vast majority of animal foods produced in the United States come from these operations, which can house thousands of pigs, or tens or even hundreds of thousands of chickens in one operation. There's a large and growing body of evidence documenting public health, as well as social, ecological, animal welfare, and economic harms of this industrial model of animal production. One of our focuses at the Center for Livable Future is understanding the transmission of contaminants from these operations to workers and nearby communities, including some harmful gases, particulate matter, heavy metals, viruses, and bacteria. So before we were looking at individual foods, now let's look a little bit at whole diets. You'll note that for these illustrations, they are specific to the US. We have a study that we modeled these impacts in different countries based on different dietary patterns, but today we're going to talk about this specific to US consumers and the foods that we're eating in our diets. And so this y-axis here shows the per person or per capita greenhouse gas footprint for a typical US citizen per year. This baseline here represents the modeled typical current consumption patterns. And then the rest from left moving to right represent increasingly plant-based options. And the shaded parts of each bar represent the contributions to our greenhouse gas footprint of different foods, with pasture expansion being in bovine meat or meat from ruminant animals being some of the greatest sections. And then another key category here from dairy is in blue and plant foods in green. And the LUC is land use change or emissions associated with deforestation primarily. We don't have a large portion of that in the US due to the fact that most of our agricultural production that involved deforestation already happened before recently. In other countries, for instance, in Europe, you do see a much larger portion of these bars represented from land use change, often from imported foods. But in the US, that's not necessarily the case. And so, as you can see, we modeled different scenarios of diets, one being a meatless day, one being a low red meat diet, one a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet or a plant-based diet that includes eggs and dairy, a pescatarian diet, which excludes meat from land animals, but does include seafood, a 2/3 vegan diet, which represents 2/3 of the meals being vegan. For example, you might have a vegan breakfast and lunch, but animal foods at dinner. And a low food chain diet, which is mostly plant-based, but includes a small amount of protein with foods that are low on the food chain. So bivalve mollusks, small fish, and insects, which, as you remember us talking about a few slides ago, are relatively climate-friendly animal foods. And then finally, an exclusively vegan diet on the right. And these diets are all modeled based on providing at least the recommended amount of calories and protein per day. And so when we scaled out one food, we scaled up another food to make sure that there was enough protein and enough calories, and that they met approximate healthy eating requirements. And so some notable findings is just that by replacing the calories from animal foods and 63% of the protein from animal foods for the vegan diet, it only increased that portion of emissions by about 5% for greenhouse gas emissions. But what's interesting is what happens when we eliminate meat, but rely more heavily on dairy, such as in the lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet. Surprisingly, this diet actually had a higher greenhouse gas footprint than eating a 2/3 vegan diet. That means that while it was lower than baseline, eliminating meat by itself and increasing dairy proportionately can actually cause more emissions than if you were to continue eating some meat, but in lower proportions. So just some interesting variables to consider, and the fact that it's not just meat, but we also have to consider emissions from dairy. And one of the key aspects of this is because the emissions associated with both beef and dairy come from ruminant animals, and they're significant sources of methane and nitrous oxide emissions, both potent greenhouse gases, and you might have heard about cow burping. So this is where the ruminant digestive process is actually one of the key contributors, and that's why these emissions are relatively high. So while eliminating meat might not be eliminating meat entirely while scaling up dairy might not be the most climate-friendly diet. And so this is just providing some alternatives to think about it, that it doesn't have to be an either or approach, that you could reduce and still have a substantial reduction in your overall emissions. You might wonder, well, what about local foods, which are often touted as a solution to climate change, especially reducing food miles? Well, these previous graphs that we looked at focused primarily on the production side of the food chain. If you also consider emissions associated with transporting food and selling it, you'll see that for the most part, production represents a much larger share of a food's footprint. The types of foods in the diet, therefore, have a bigger impact on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions than changing how far the foods come from. And I will add a caveat that since we produced this slide, there has been a new study that came out that is challenging the proportion that is associated with transportation, with a global estimate closer to 19%. But either way, we're still looking at a large portion associated with production versus transportation. And there are also some key other elements in there, one being transportation does matter a lot for certain foods, particularly produce and fish or seafood. So if you're consuming those, it's important to recognize foods that are very perishable and that come by plane can have a relatively significant portion of greenhouse gas emissions associated with their transportation. So just a little bit of a nuance. For the most part, changing what you eat is more important than where it came from, with those exceptions. And so here's putting these numbers into context. What do healthier and sustainable diets look like? In general, they are plant-rich and have moderate to low amounts of animal products, and that they are an appropriate calorie amount and have minimally refined grains and added sugars for health reasons, but also that they have a diversity of relatively minimally processed foods. I listed this here as a reminder of, we often hear you should eat your fruits and vegetables, and fruits and vegetables are important, but I think it's interesting that in some studies that have looked at what foods we actually need to scale up more of, the legumes is really where we need to focus. And so pulses like lentils and beans, soy and peanuts, which are legumes, but not necessarily pulses. That category in particular is where most people are consuming much less than what we need to. Whole grains, vegetables and fruits, nuts and seeds, we still need to scale some of those up, and relatively lower amounts of sustainably produced animal products can still be part of a healthy and sustainable diet. It's just important to think about the proportions in relative amounts to other types of foods. And more sustainable diets can also be healthy for us. Just including a figure here from a report from the Lancet Global Health that shows how most of the foods with lower greenhouse gas footprints are also associated with reduced risks for many chronic diseases, including coronary heart disease or CHD in some of these figures, certain cancers, stroke, diabetes. And at the same time, some of the foods with the highest climate impacts are also less healthy. The strongest evidence here is for cutting processed meats, such as bacon and sausage, and red meat, such as beef, pork, and lamb. There are some nuances with seafood in particular, because not all seafood is the same. From a sustainability and health perspective, it's best to focus on fish that are lower on the food chain, as they have some of the same omega-3 benefits as other fatty fish, and also put less pressure on the environment in terms of overfishing and greenhouse gas emissions. But on a whole, most seafood is quite good from a health perspective. There might not be enough to sustain us all to eat the amounts that we need to reap those health benefits. So that's where we really emphasize the importance of fish lower on the food chain. Before concluding this section, though, I want to mention that it's important to recognize how food systems climate solutions can be more equitable. And so it's important to recognize there's no one size fits all approach, and that there are inequities in our current animal product consumption. And so this figure here on the right shows the top 10 countries with the highest meat consumption per capita. And it's important to recognize that when we're talking about shifting diets, the onus is on the most affluent consumers in the countries that consume the most. And so the United States is one of those top 10 countries, as are some our peers in Canada and Australia, Hong Kong, Israel, and some in South America as well. And that there are many researchers and advocates who advocate for a shrink and share approach, which focuses on those needs for the most affluent to be reducing the most, because they're, for the most part, consuming the most. And we shouldn't be asking people to be reducing their animal product intake in places that are experiencing malnutrition or already consume relatively low amounts of animal products. That this needs to be, the emphasis needs to be on those who are currently consuming the most and who have more opportunities for reducing their footprints. And even within countries that have a relatively high per capita intake, it's also important to recognize that consumers have different abilities to eat healthier and more climate-friendly foods. And while some climate-friendly foods and proteins can be very affordable, such as dried beans and lentils, they do require longer amounts of time to cook and prepare. And many people, especially those who are juggling multiple jobs, might not have the time and capacity to cook and prepare those foods. And meanwhile, other climate-friendly foods can be more expensive than the products they're intended to replace. For instance, some meat alternatives or dairy alternatives. And accessibility is also key. It's much harder to eat healthy, climate-friendly meals if they're not easily available and affordable and accessible to you. And so these equity considerations are really important to consider in light of the idea that food choices don't exist within a vacuum, and that we make these choices within the context of our social and physical environments, with factors including social norms, cost, convenience, and, as we mentioned, availability and accessibility, all being important and can actually all outweigh the knowledge and willpower we might have to make sustainable food choices. For many of these reasons, the nutritionist and well-known scholar in the food systems world, Dr. Marianne Nestle, and she has no relation to the food company Nestle, said, vote with your fork and vote with your vote. And that's recognizing that our food choices matter as individuals, but addressing climate change is going to require more than just the behaviors of individuals. It's going to require changing policies to make it easier and more equitable to advance the changes that we need. And so that's where we're going to turn to some promising policy solutions to address food systems related emissions. And I've kind of grouped these into three categories. One around values-based food procurement. And this is focusing on this increasing effort among many organizations and people who are eating at these institutions to change what's available at our hospitals, our schools, our universities, our businesses, to provide more climate-friendly, but also other foods that align with our values, whether that be local and regional, or fair trade, or humanely raised foods, but that we are changing what foods are available and not necessarily restricting options, but offering more choices so that people who want to make those choices have that option available. And there was one stat before COVID-19 that about half of our meals consumed in the US were consumed away from home. And so this is a really big potential to address some of the large portion of our meals that aren't at home and that are less in individuals' control. It's much harder to eat this way if there's not even an option available. So there are a lot of advocates across the board advocating in this area, and I'll give some examples in the coming slides. There are also efforts underway to reduce the amount of food that we waste by tracking and reducing it, and we can talk about some examples. And then also some policies to mitigate the environmental impacts, and I should say health impacts, of current agricultural practices. And so in terms of procurement policies or purchasing at institutions, how are some ways that we could make these purchases more sustainable and equitable? So some focus on changing the types of meal options. As we talked about, it is really important to consider that it's not just where your food comes from, but what types of foods that are offered. So having more options, including, for instance, a black bean burger instead of or in addition to a beef burger. We often advocate for the in addition to rather than the taking away the choice, but giving extra choices, giving people that option rather than restricting it. You can also change the source of meal ingredients. And this is really getting at those other values, apart from necessarily just climate-friendly procurement, but you might want to be supporting a beef producer that raises the cattle with more animal welfare standards and more sustainable practices altogether, and as a local producer. And another option is to change the proportions of the ingredients in the meals. And so instead of offering a 6-ounce burger, changing it to a 4-ounce burger, or in some cases, some efforts have been to blend the burgers. So it might have some beef, but contain some alternative mushroom. Complex is a popular one to have a combined meat mushroom dish. One example of a specific organizational effort to advance more climate-friendly procurement is the Cool Food Pledge by the World Resources Institute. And dining facilities across the world, including restaurants, hotels, city governments, universities, can sign on to this commitment, which indicates a commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions associated with their food service by 25% by 2030, relative to a baseline in 2015. And this is a level that's in line with the Paris Climate Agreement that we talked about earlier. And members of this commitment or pledge report their food purchases to the organization, which then uses a calculator based on peer-reviewed literature to track and document their efforts. And this figure here is from a recent update. This is showing only those who have signed the pledge before 2019. There have been a lot more that have signed it since. In fact, they're at 63 member institutions, or sometimes they're aggregates of institutions, but 63 members serving a collective 3.5 billion meals per year. Of those who signed it earlier, they have made some substantial changes in their total emissions. So you can see by 2021, they were very close to the target in 2030. Now, this comes a few caveats, because some of this decline is actually just a decline in overall food purchases due to COVID-19. But there is a significant portion of this decline that is from reducing the emissions associated with animal-based foods, and especially beef and lamb. As another example of a climate-friendly food procurement policy, the nonprofit Friends of the Earth has been leading various policy campaigns with the effort to shift towards fewer and better, meaning more sustainably and ethically produced animal products, and at the same time adding healthier and more plant-forward sustainable foods in a variety of institutions, including K through 12 schools, city and county governments, and recently some efforts to change procurement at federal facilities. One of their first major victories in the policy arena was the DC Green Food Purchasing Act of 2021. It was unanimously passed by the Washington, DC Council, and the legislation will measure and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the food that the city purchases by 25%, and make other improvements to environmentally preferable purchasing across the city. It also makes it the first jurisdiction in the whole country to establish a target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with their food purchases at public facilities. I might be a bit biased because I helped testify for this in support of the bill. There were several other organizations too, but I believe that this is the first of many similar initiatives that will be passed at local and state levels. Another example, 30 to 40% of the current US food supply is either lost or wasted. By reducing food waste, you're reducing all of those greenhouse gas emissions that we talked about that are embedded within the food. So it's critical, and one of the top 2 most important ways that we can address food systems emissions, in addition to the shifting to the more plant-forward diets. And so food waste and reducing food waste is critical. And it may happen across the whole supply chain. The reason that we say food supply loss or wasted is that the loss happens pre-consumer and the waste happens once we get to the consumer or retailer level. And so these policies that can address these emissions across the supply chain include pre-consumer efforts, such as policies that offer financial incentives to farmers to donate surplus foods to emergency food providers. And in Maryland, we actually have a program that offers a tax credit against your state income taxes. And this supports farmers in being able to help prevent some of that that surplus food from going to waste, and giving them a tax incentive at the same time. There are also social and cultural norms around what foods we like to see. And you might have seen documentaries on this, but just there are certain things that grocery stores can only offer because consumers are expecting it. And so the more that we can offer and encourage institutional buyers, for instance, to serve less popular or unattractive foods that would otherwise be wasted, is another great example of a way that institutional policies especially can help change that market. If you're going to be cutting up some fruit anyway, does it really matter what exactly it looked like on the outside as long as it's still good to eat? Probably not, but a consumer might not have picked it up in a grocery store, because I don't know about you, but most of us tend to go to the store and look for the very best product and then pick it. And so that's where a lot of waste also ends up. There's another challenge with food labeling, and that expiration dates aren't standardized, and that there's a lot of confusion over them. And in many cases, they are more best by dates, not necessarily you must eat before or you will get sick date. So the more that we can standardize those to make it easier to help consumers, but also to prevent people from throwing out food that actually could be consumed safely, is really important. And then as a last measure, supporting composting. So we want to get to the point where we're preventing food from needing to be composted, that we're eating it earlier on in the supply chain, because even if you are composting it, you still have all those emissions associated with its production that are going to be going to waste. But it is still preferable to compost it than to put it in a landfill where it will generate more emissions. So this is kind of a last resort, but it's still a very important one. And there are municipalities across the world, some in the US, many in Europe, and other countries too, that are helping consumers compost by offering it as a curbside collection service, similar to your municipal trash collection and recycling collection. I lived in Cardiff, Wales for 1 year for my master's degree, and we had a curbside compost pickup. And there are some issues to work through there, but it was a fantastic service. And I'm hopeful. We're seeing some efforts in Baltimore City now. If you can go to the farmer's market and bring your compost there. I'm hopeful that maybe we'll see more across the board, and that this will become a more standardized practice to help reduce the overall amount of trash and waste that we are sending to landfills or sending to be burned. And then lastly, speaking to the broader health and climate concerns associated with industrial food animal production in particular, there are many policy efforts underway at both the state level and the federal level to increase regulation and strengthen the oversight of that industry, whether it be around air pollution, antibiotic use, manure management, and to even place moratoria on the creation of new industrial livestock operations. At the same time, there are also efforts to support farmers who are transitioning away from these systems, to support more no-till or low-till farming, reforestation, and encouraging shifts from annual to perennial crops. Perennial crops are particularly important because they help sequester the carbon further down into the soil. And as we mentioned, while there are a lot of nuances with livestock grazing operations, there are still many environmental benefits and social benefits and animal welfare benefits they provide, and to support farmers and better managing their operations to reap those benefits. And also there are some discussions around specific changes or tweaks to livestock feed that could potentially reduce methane. There are debates over this, and I don't know enough to get into the nuances, but happy to send some literature your way if you're really interested in that topic. Just as a few examples of policies in this area, the Farm System Reform Act was proposed by Senator Cory Booker and Representative Ro Khanna in 2019. It was reintroduced in 2021, I believe. And one of the aspects of that act is proposing a national moratorium on new concentrated animal feeding operations and with the goal of eliminating them all in the US by 2040. The bill would also provide a $100 billion voluntary buyout program for contract farmers who wish to transition away from the industrial livestock operation model. And while it hasn't passed, it has been endorsed by hundreds of advocacy organizations across the country. And it's really started an important national conversation around limiting the harms of these industrial livestock operations. There's also been demonstrated support for this by the American Public Health Association in 2019 and by many local citizens. And colleagues at the center where I work did a poll in 2019 of consumers and residents of Iowa and North Carolina, which are some of the largest hog producing states in the US. And the vast majority of them supported a ban on future CAFOs and were concerned about their effect on the health and the economy. And there was a recent poll that was updated, and nationally now we've actually have a majority of US respondents now saying they support a moratorium. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes, but there is a lot of policy momentum to better regulate these existing operations. So lastly, and then we can get into questions. I'd love to, I know that there's some chat that's been coming in, but I haven't been able to keep up with it. Addressing our food systems emissions is essential to meeting our climate mitigation targets, and we need to do it from multiple different angles all at the same time. It's critical, it's urgent, and very necessary. At the same time, when shifting diets in particular, it can be very sensitive. There's culture, there's affordability and accessibility, and we really need to take a holistic perspective when we're considering asking people to make behavior changes that are going to be hard and challenging. And remembering that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach, that there is room for some animal foods on climate friendly menus, especially the lower food chain varieties. But even apart from those, moderate amounts of animal proteins can be part of a healthier, more sustainable future. And at the same time, it's important to remember that it's not just meat, but also dairy does contribute to our climate change, to greenhouse gases that therefore contribute to climate change. And also remembering that what we eat and the types of foods that we eat are generally more important for climate change than how far it travels, with that exception of it's important to try to reduce air freighted produce and fish whenever possible. There is no one size fits all solution for this. And that's why, while individual changes matter, policy solutions are really necessary, and where most of the attention should be to help make us have an easier and more affordable and accessible opportunity to have more sustainable diets for everyone. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and would love to hear some of your questions and feedback.
Okay, so why don't we start with the questions that are in the chat? So Ruth Ann had asked, where does reforestation figure in these equations? And this was earlier in your talk, I think, when you were estimating the impact of certain diets, I think.
Yes, so the specific studies I looked at did not include reforestation more broadly. They were focused primarily on food systems emissions, with one exception being that chart I took from Project Drawdown's report I actually took out one of the rows that I originally had in there to make it simpler to explain and also less visually overwhelming. But they do show the potential sequestration potential of above ground biomass, including trees. There is a significant potential there. It is and will probably be very necessary. I think one of the key elements is when we talk about land use change and when we talk about shifting diets to provide more land, that to prevent that additional pressure for further deforestation. An important consideration for all of these is that if you're freeing up land, it needs to be clear that that land is being freed up for reforestation or for more sustainable practices and not, for instance, for redevelopment. And so it's really kind of a policy challenge in addition to an environmental challenge, because there are often debates and discussions around, well, if you shifted toward more plants, it would require less land and therefore we could reforest. But that doesn't necessarily happen unless there are policy solutions paired with those changes in demand. And it's tricky and hard. And there have been people who have tried to model it. I think another big challenge is trade patterns. And so while consumers in one country might reduce consumption of one product, the production might still continue at that level and just be exported out to other countries. And it's a challenge because that could actually help on the global scale if that exporting is preventing further deforestation in, for instance, South America. And if you can produce more soy, for instance, in the US, and then they wouldn't need to produce as much in Brazil, it could be a potential solution, but there are just a lot of trade-offs, and it's hard to balance all of those when most of these policy decisions are happening at a national or even state level rather than the global level. It's not like there's some key decision maker out there who say, this is where all these different foods should come from. It's a very complicated mess. And so how do we make sure that we pair the potential solutions that we want to see from changes in behaviors and changes in policies with these other long-term policy solutions, and doing that across different jurisdictions and countries can be really challenging.
Thank you for that. So Mary has a question. Without major reductions in all animal consumption, isn't rewilding reforestation a big problem?
I'm trying to think about.
And if we need Mary to unmute and
if you could explain that a little bit further, Mary, I'd appreciate it.
I'm sorry, I've entered a couple of things. Which one was this?
This was the comment about without major reductions in all animal consumption, isn't rewilding reforestation a big problem?
Correct. My understanding is that if we want to, that especially animal-based regenerative agriculture takes up a massive amount of land. There are actually benefits, if you will, in that sense to conventional confined animal feeding operations. And if we need to rewild just to stay alive and stem the biodiversity crisis, don't we need some kind of limits on how much animal-based regenerative agriculture we can allow?
Thank you for the clarification. And yes, there are definitely debates over the extent to which more pasture-based systems, which do require more land, can meet our current demand. And I think that's the key element there, is that we have to reduce demand significantly while still considering these alternative solutions and production systems. It's important to recognize we cannot sustain our current demand levels from a land perspective, but also from a climate perspective. So I agree with you.
There's a request in the chat for you to put your last summary slide on the screen. So maybe you could share your screen and just put that slide up. People want to copy it. And then
which slide was it? I apologize.
Your summary slide.
Oh,
so if you can put that up, and then we'll keep going with the questions. Jan asks, is there any verifiable evidence of shift toward better operations and sustainability at the present time? If so, what are the experiences as to challenges and motivations? What's working?
Yeah, I mean, I think the example from the Cool Food Pledge and the institutions that have adopted it and have adopted it about 5 or more years ago that have made substantial reductions in some of their emissions associated with their food procurement is a great example. There are several other institutions that are doing similar efforts at tracking and working to reduce their food-related emissions. The most substantial emissions tend to come from reductions in the beef on the menu in particular. But and in this particular case with the Cool Food Pledge, one chunk of it also came from they were serving fewer foods altogether during COVID-19, but there was about 20% of their reduction came from the reduction in animal products served. So there are institutions that are doing it. There are some efforts underway right now to collect and collate examples and good practices to be shared. There are also efforts by other organizations. There's the Menus of Change collaborative, which is working across universities. And then there's also a menus of change effort with chefs and food service workers to help train and change the operations in terms of what to cook and how to cook it, and to really share those good recipes and examples. So there are efforts underway to spread the word. I would also say another example, there are challenges with this, but that I have noticed is an increased offering of more plant-forward menu items at restaurants, and less institutional food service, but more generally other out-of-home food operations. And I said that there's a little bit of challenge because sometimes they primarily tend to rely on the heavily processed meat alternatives, and I'm happy to dive into that if you'd want. We did a paper on meat alternatives and thinking about them from a food systems and public health perspective, and they do provide some benefits over traditional farmed meats. There are some questions still around their full potential. From a health perspective, we don't necessarily know their long-term impacts, especially compared to less processed alternatives. But from an environmental perspective, they do tend to have fewer emissions than most of the animal foods that they're tending to replace. So there is some potential there, and just seeing how fast menus have changed over the last decade. My hope is that this will encourage restaurants to continue offering more plant-forward menu items, including the less processed legumes that have even clearer health and environmental benefits.
So Andrea asks, how about the impact related to packaging? So much is packaged in plastic, which is currently not recycled in our area or most places around the country.
Great question, Andrea. And it's a challenge. So from a climate perspective exclusively, the challenge of packaging is that it's not actually a large proportion of food's footprint from a greenhouse gas perspective, but there are a lot of other sustainability implications associated with waste and plastic waste in particular. And as you mentioned, the challenges with recycling, and even if they are recycled, maybe not being recycled in the right quantities or the right types of plastics to be recycled. So there's definitely some key sustainability issues more broadly, apart from necessarily just climate. There are also some debates because in some cases, plastic can help extend the shelf life of a food and prevent waste that way. So it might not necessarily be the most climate harmful part of our food system. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be addressing the concerns that are related to plastic.
So we're coming down to time, but there's one last one that just came in. Are there ways to reduce food waste, like policies being considered?
Yeah, so there's a great organization called ReFed that has a policy tracker that looks at different policies that are being passed in jurisdictions across the country. So I encourage you, I think it was on one of my earlier slides. If you look here, RE and then FED, ReFed, their food waste policy finder. And that'll be a great tool. It's interactive, and I encourage you to use it to look at some of the nuanced policies. As one I mentioned was in Maryland, how we have a tax incentive for farmers to donate surplus food that would otherwise go to waste. It's one example, but there are many others across the country. And this policy finder, it's a great tool that you can use to look more into that.